We'll go ahead and get started if everyone could find their seats. So greetings, my name is Reddy and I teach here at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this panel entitled Challenges and Opportunities for Animals under the New Administration and Current Congress. It seems that at least once a week I hear one foundational representative or another, whether it's Joe Biden or John McCain, observing how our state of affairs was not always so partisan. I think I'd be lying if I didn't say I felt the same. Yet I'm heartened to see the diversity of voices advocating on behalf of animal-related issues, that groundswell of support evidenced by the bipartisan membership of the Animal Protection Caucus and reflected here in this room. Here to discuss those challenges and opportunities for animals in the current political landscape, hurdles that have been recently presented themselves, as well as new paths forward, are Tracie Letterman and Nancy Perry, both of whom I should just add earned their JDs here in Portland and so are making their return home. Speaking first is Tracie Letterman, Vice President of Federal Affairs at the Humane Society Legislative Fund. Tracie oversees the organization's federal agenda, working closely with our congressmen and congresswomen and federal agencies on a wide range of issues, from pursuing puppy mill regulations to combating efforts to roll back conservation regulations and animal protection laws. Second is Nancy Perry, Head of Government Relations at the ASPCA, where she directs the organization's legislative efforts and policy work at the state, federal, and local levels. Notably, Nancy has testified in congressional hearings and helped pass laws on animal crush videos, fur, puppy imports, animal fighting, horse slaughter, as well as been an architect and leader with respect to more than 20 successful state ballot initiatives. She is also an Animal Law Review Advisory Board member and instructor at George Washington Law School. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Hi everyone, it's so nice to be here. I went to Lewis and Clark Law School and it's just so great to be back. I hope one of the takeaways that you get from our presentation and even many of the other speakers is there's many different pathways to helping animals. Now, many of you probably came here today because you're wondering about the election results from last year and how that has impacted the progress on animal protection issues. So fortunately, animal protection is not a one-party issue. Our goal in the animal protection movement is to encourage everyone, whether Republican, Democrat, Independent, to hold these values. Everyone should oppose animal cruelty. And in fact, every priority bill that we work on has a Republican and Democrat co-sponsor. So generally speaking, animal protection is bipartisan. So today I'll point out some examples where we're seeing some positive signs and then also some areas where there is a political divide. So starting with a fun fact, it's very uncommon for one party to have control of both houses of Congress and the White House. But you can see that it has happened 8 times since the founding of the Humane Society of the United States in 1954. So on the legislative side, I'm going to highlight some issues that have some very strong bipartisan support. So 10 months into the 115th Congress, there's 3 bills that we're advocating for that have 240 or more co-sponsors, and that's huge. That's more than half the House. And then 3 other bills are approaching 200 co-sponsors. So I think this is a very strong sign of the bipartisan support of animal issues. So the first bill is the Prevent All Soaring Tactics Act. And soaring is intentionally damaging a horse's legs and feet in order to produce a high-stepping gait. It's illegal, it has been illegal for over 40 years. And so this bill will tighten enforcement by eliminating the industry self-policing and the devices associated with soaring. Next, we have the Shark Fin Trade and Sales Elimination Act, and this bans the trade of shark fins. It expands upon the Shark Fin Prohibition Act of 2010, which prohibited the finning of sharks at sea, which is a brutal, cruel act. So about 73 million sharks are killed each year all around the world for their fins. And the fins are primarily used in shark fin soup. It's an Asian delicacy. And we believe that sharks are worth more alive than in a bowl of soup. Then we have the Preventing Animal Cruelty and Torture Act. This is a federal anti-cruelty bill that would complement the state anti-cruelty laws by prohibiting malicious acts of animal cruelty in interstate commerce or on federal property. Now, there's a documented link between animal cruelty and violence towards people, and so the National Sheriff's Association and the Fraternal Order of Police have come out in support of this bill. Now, in terms of legislative challenges, the main ones that we have seen have been with wildlife issues. Now, a rarely used tool, the Congressional Review Act, was used repeatedly by Republicans at the beginning of the 115th Congress, and it was used to roll back Obama-era rules that were finalized at the end of the administration. 14 rules were repealed, including a wildlife one. This was from Fish and Wildlife, and it would prohibit egregious methods of hunting, and I'm talking about killing baby bears and wolves in their dens along with their mothers on national wildlife refuges in Alaska. And sadly, this rule was repealed. Now, the vote went down party lines largely, but in the House, there were 10 Republicans who bucked party leadership and said, no, we're not going to repeal this rule. But then there were 5 Democrats who voted to repeal the rule. In the Senate, almost completely down party lines. Senator King from Maine was the only one. He's an independent, and he usually votes along with the Democrats, but he voted along with the Republicans to repeal the rule. Now, we're seeing numerous attacks on the Endangered Species Act, including attacks to delist wolves, and we're seeing it in appropriations bills, standalone bills, it's added on to hunting bills, and so we're spending a lot of time addressing this issue. There's another bill that you may not have heard of. It's very new. It's called the SAVES Act, and it would delist foreign or native species from the Endangered Species Act. So what that means is that someone could breed tigers, open up a captive game farm, put up a fence, allow people to come in, pay a fee, and shoot tigers in an enclosed setting. It would also upend the wildlife trafficking laws. This is very concerning, this bill, and it has already passed out of committee a few weeks ago, and it's very possible that it could go on the House floor in a few weeks. Now, in terms of regulatory challenges, I'll start off with that. So in June, the Department of Interior delisted the greater Yellowstone ecosystem population of grizzly bears. And to be fair, the Obama administration started the process, but they seemed to sit on it for a while. And then once the Trump administration got into office, they issued the final rule. And we do not believe that the science supports the delisting of these bears. Now, the Obama administration issued an order to phase out the use of lead ammunition in fishing tackle on national wildlife refuges by 2020. So this is good for the environment, it's good for public health, there's alternatives available, it's a great thing. But on Secretary Zinke's very first day in office, he repealed this order. Now, with horse soaring, in one of the biggest regulatory debacles I have seen in my career was the Obama administration's attempt to finalize the horse soaring rule. They took many years to issue this rule, and the last week of the administration, they posted the final rule on their website. There was a backup at the Federal Register, which is very common with administrations at the very end because all the agencies are trying to get their rules out. So they said that the final rule would be in the Federal Register on the last day. So the last day came and the last day went and there was no rule. There was tons of finger pointing, but at the end of the day, the rule's not finalized because it was never in the Federal Register. So when the Trump administration came in, 155 Republicans reached out to the White House requesting that this final rule go to the Federal Register, and it has yet to be sent. This is an issue that I'm assuming most of you are aware of. It got a lot of media attention when USDA took down the Animal Welfare Act and Horse Protection Act enforcement records. Now, slowly, the agency has been reposting the rules, the enforcement records, but there's still major transparency problems. So, for example, we track the dog dealer inspection records, and we'll see up there a dog dealer with all of the violations posted, but the name is blacked out. So it's impossible to know what dealer had these violations. So for consumers who are going online and trying to track a certain dealer that they want to buy a puppy from, they can't. And at the Humane Society, we have experts that analyze these enforcement records for years now. They have gone through these enforcement records and said, here's the top 100 worst dealers. And this has been a very helpful report, and they can't do it now. So this continues to be a serious problem. Now, for regulatory opportunities, I'm going to highlight a few positive signs, and I think once more political appointees are confirmed, we'll start to see more and more opportunities. But the first one involves the AWA licensing. So USDA is taking public comment on an advance notice of proposed rulemaking on their licensing scheme. And I think this is very positive that USDA leadership sees the need to reform their regulations to strengthen compliance. So they're looking at ways to close loopholes and to keep unfit businesses from automatically getting a license. And this has been a problem that we have been advocating for the agency to change for decades. And what happens is that an exhibitor, roadside zoo, dog dealer, puppy mill, they'll have continuous violations and automatically get their license renewed. So we're very pleased to see that the agency is taking it on. Now take notice, it's just an idea they're considering. We don't have a proposed rule yet, but we're encouraging them to move it forward. So the comment period closes on the 23rd, and actually on Friday I looked up and it's about 35,000 comments that have been posted, and our experts are going through them, and they say that the majority of people want to see regulatory reform. So I encourage you to go onto our website and you can get a comment over to the agency. Next is wildlife trafficking. The Trump administration has indicated that wildlife trafficking is a priority. Very early on in the administration, they issued an executive order on international trafficking, and it included wildlife. And then a few weeks ago, you may have heard, there was some media attention on it, there was a rhino horn smuggler and they cracked down. So we are encouraging Fish and Wildlife to continue this strong wildlife trafficking enforcement. So just to conclude, eliminating animal cruelty is a message that all parties should support, and we will continue advocating with the legislative branch, the executive branch, to continue pushing protections for all animals.
It really is wonderful to be here 25 years later after the very first Animal Law Conference. Just since we have an extra moment, I'm going to just add some color to how different things are. Our first conference, it was about this size overall, and we had no money. We weren't a legitimate student group yet, so we had no funding. So we had to ask the catering service at the law school to front us the money for the banquet, and then we charged CLE credits and were able to, I think we were $41 over at the end of the conference. So we were pretty encouraged by that, and it is extraordinarily encouraging to see the level of energy, the professionalism, the breadth of the talents that are here at this conference, the topics that have been covered. We're really seeing growth in this movement. And while we have a somewhat sobering topic to cover today, I think that it is that kind of movement that cannot be stopped, and that will, as the pendulum swings, will bring us the kinds of change that we really do need to see. So there's a optimistic note to start on. I struggled a little bit thinking about this title and this challenge of presenting this. I had given a similar talk in June. It turns out to be the hot topic this year. People like me who work on legislation all the time are usually asked to come and present on, what are some interesting trends at the state level? What's the hot new policy issue? What's before Congress right now? How do we do outreach better? Those are the kinds of topics that we often will be asked to come and speak on. This is very specific, and when I looked at the title and the request on this talk, I thought, all right, I think that what we're being asked to talk about is, what does it really mean for animals? Let's be real. Let's talk about what the challenges and opportunities are, noting that challenges comes first. So with that in mind, yes, it is true that we are up against a unique challenge with this administration. And you can see from what Tracie's already told us that that's not the end of the story. It's not all gloom and doom. But the challenges are going to require all of us to be engaged in a way we haven't in the past, to be scrappy and to persevere. And I think those are the qualities that we've exhibited already as a group. And so I am actually very heartened today as we get this opportunity to talk. So I thought by now, though, when we set this topic, that we might know more. I'm talking about it in June, there's not much to say yet. Surely by September, October, we're going to start to have some more results in, and we're going to get a good feel for where this administration is. I'm tentatively happy to report that we don't have a lot more to say yet. Some of it, you already heard from Tracie, there have been some hard results. Some things are really in a dialogue stage, so I'm going to be slightly vague sometimes in sharing with you where some of these issues are, and I'm going to try to offer opportunities for how you can engage in a meaningful way. So let's focus now on what those challenges and opportunities look like, in no particular order, although because Gus is on the screen, he's asking that we start with a challenge. And as you saw from what Tracie already shared with you, horses are a live topic at a federal level. Congress deals with horse protection issues in a variety of ways. We're not even covering all of them today. But some of the prominent ones that I'll detail for you present challenges that are a work in progress. The first and foremost, as you might tell from this slide, is related to our wild horse population. Just to give you a sense of that population and who they are and what they're about, and for those of you who aren't already experts on this, and I know some people in the room really are, I want to share what Congress said when it passed the original legislation to protect wild horses in 1971, and Richard Nixon signed that bill. Congress finds and declares that wild, free-roaming horses and burros are living symbols of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West, that they contribute to the diversity of life forms within the nation and enrich the lives of the American people, and that these horses are fast disappearing from the American scene. So we have an acknowledgement in statute that these are living symbols of our spirit as a nation, and that they enrich our spirit, and that they contribute to diversity. These are important notes and wonderful sentiments expressed and codified. And over the history, since 1971, we've seen a long, slow degradation of this concept. And a lot of you may have been involved in some of the litigation efforts to ensure that these animals didn't lose their protections. I'm here to tell you we're at a crossroads on this issue. We are no longer in the long, slow, quiet slide. We're in a moment of great moment. It's incredibly important what will happen now. And so the long mismanagement, if you're familiar with it, has involved an agency put in charge, the Bureau of Land Management, who didn't really know anything about horses, didn't really care much about horses, certainly didn't want this power, and is charged with balancing the interests of a lot of different industries who use the public lands under their authority. So their job is to figure out the right, proper balance. And that has been the challenge, because some of those interests enjoy a disproportionate access and ability to reach members of Congress, as you can imagine. And I don't want to be too nuanced. The ag industry, as we all know, has done a wonderful job developing relationships with key chair people in committees in Congress and at the state level, and are very threatened by the potential of any forward motion for animal protection, let alone a species that they consider competitive with their interests. So that's been the crux of the challenge to a great extent. It doesn't mean there aren't other industries that are problematic, there are, but the ag industry has definitely been one of the primary challenges. So when Congress passed that bill, there was a small number of wild horses left after an onslaught, after years and years of going out onto the Western Plains and just gunning down wild horses, or capturing them and removing them so that they could be reduced to pet food or used for any other commercial purpose. If anyone's seen Marilyn Monroe's last film, The Misfits, then you know how poignant that struggle was and what she was giving voice to in that role. And it really is sad to see that this agency has not really honored what Congress indicated they should be doing. The dynamic is that the horses naturally are, as a prey species, they grow. And there are different reports on how much they grow per year. 15 to 20% is an outlandish figure. At the same time, they have a limited population, or excuse me, habitat. And one of the problems we've had is that Bureau of Land Management has been squeezing their habitat. Since the passage of the original legislation, they've lost 41% of their habitat. That's almost 50%. And that's due to the checkerboard nature of these lands, and due to a lot of other competing pressures, due to drought, due to wildfire, due to a lot of circumstances that are beyond the agency's control, for sure. But it tells us something about the squeeze play that these animals are put in. So the agency has relied on really one primary strategy to manage their on-range life, and that is to round them up and to remove them from the range. Initially, there were more vibrant adoption programs, and that enabled these horses to go into homes, which some of us might feel is a sad result for a wild animal, but certainly it is a better result than what was happening before 1971. And so we worked with the agency and said, you know, you really ought to think about how you're going to manage these animals on the range so they can live out their lives in the wild. And that was the conversation for decades. Advocates, members of Congress, the National Academies of Science, any number of other scientific experts have repeatedly implored the BLM, please use contraceptive, use fertility control as a way to ensure that these animals don't populate beyond their means, beyond what you're allowing them to have as habitat, so that we get into a crisis. And so the Bureau of Land Management sort of found it cumbersome. It's sort of a pain, you know, this technology that's developed, which is actually highly effective and proven to be humane, doesn't impact the environment. It has a lot of advantages. It's been used very effectively for the Chincoteague ponies. If you read the Misty book, you know their story. The Shackelford horses off North Carolina, for other discrete populations of wild horses, wild elephants in Africa, deer populations all over. So it's known to be effective to keep the population at a reasonable level. The agency just has found it cumbersome. And as a result of that, they've really not invested energy in it. And they've started to say it just doesn't work. And that's not true. It works. But you have to know how to employ it. You have to train people. You have to do it diligently. And you have to be as thorough as possible so you don't leave large numbers of horses unvaccinated on the range. And it shouldn't be used, obviously, to completely reduce the population overall. But that's not the situation we're in now. We have had an agency not even employing roundups recently because they're now spending so much money on the horses they've put in government corrals that almost their entire budget goes to maintaining that population off the range. So now we have about 73,000 horses by BLM's count out on the range, which is dramatically over what they call the appropriate management level, a statutory requirement that they determine. And so we're in an overpopulation moment, even though many of us might argue that that is a controversial way to describe it. But the realities are this agency has a mandate to do something at this point. So what have they done? Well, this administration came out the door in 2018 with the budget proposal to allow the euthanasia of healthy wild horses and to allow their sale to the highest bidder, to require it, in fact. And that is a death sentence. Both of those options are death sentences, obviously. Selling to the highest bidder for a wild animal means going directly to a kill buyer who will convert that animal into a profit at sales, at slaughterhouses. Killing or euthanizing wild horses, I mean, imagine what we're talking about. We're talking about thousands of horses that they would use this as a population control program for. And while it sounds good in media reports and when members of Congress are describing this to each other, they say, listen, they're starving on the range. Also not true. And so we have to do something for their own well-being. We're going to euthanize them. Well, we all know euthanasia. We know what it is. We know that it can be a gift to an animal who is suffering if employed for their own individual benefit. This is not euthanasia. We're talking about government officials entering pastures of thousands of horses. And what do you imagine they might have to do to kill those horses? I know what I imagine. I imagine a bloodbath. I imagine gunning down thousands of wild horses in pastures in front of each other. I can't imagine another way that they would accomplish this euthanasia. So our job has been to uncover that, to argue that that's not appropriate. The House Appropriations Committee, where this is an issue, where this is a live vote, didn't understand that. And Congressman Stewart advanced an amendment that he very specifically included language that wouldn't allow slaughter, interestingly, because he's understood the political dynamics there, but will allow the euthanasia of wild horses. That passed on a voice vote in the House committee, so it's a little wobbly. It's open to negotiation. Just 2 days ago, the Senate announced they're marking up this bill next week. So we will see what the Senate will do on it next week. Our hope is that they'll retain those protections, because what's happened is the White House issued that proposal. There was a massive outcry. Thank you to those of you who were involved in that. And they've understood now that this is a politically untenable approach forward, or at least they have a good, strong hint. And there's a lot of dialogue occurring right now about what the way forward might look like. So the pressure is now building, and we're in a moment where I think, if we can call it an opportunity, I think there is one there, because the pressure is very high here. And no one wants to be the one who killed the wild horses. So I think it will require some stretching on our community's part. I think we're going to have to agree to some kind of combination of strategies that will involve removing horses, but we're going to have to identify less effective sanctuary options. And we're going to have an ironclad agreement from an agency that's not done a good job on this, that they will employ immunocontraceptive on the range so that we don't wind up back here immediately. And it will take time, and it will require patience, and it will not happen overnight. So those are big requests from an agency and an administration that isn't patient, that isn't long-term thinking. So where will we be? I don't know. I don't know the answer. I'm being honest with you that I think we have to get to a place where we avoid these animals becoming dead symbols instead of live symbols. And I hope that you will help us in that effort. I'll start my mantra of telling you that there's a way to act to help. The ASPCA.org website has a /brigade option, so we have a shortcut to joining our advocacy brigade. I am sure all of you are already on our advocacy brigade, but if you're not, I urge you to join, because what we do, we don't fundraise off our brigade. I know that that's the worry. We will reach you when there is that pivotal moment, when a decision is going to be made, and we will provide you with the knowledge that it's coming, who you need to reach out to, how you need to reach out to them, and proper messaging to be effective. So we want to really use your time well in this quest to bring a good result for these animals. So please join us in that effort. The moment is now. Okay, so we've talked about wild horses. What about domestic horses? Where are we on that perennial debate on horse slaughter? Well, this is a big one. It is a live topic as well. It's far from disposed of. For those of you unfamiliar to the issue, I'll give you a 30-second summary. Unfortunately, in this country, we have not banned the slaughter of our own domestic horses that are not raised for food, we have allowed them to be shuttled off to horse slaughterhouses. For a period of time, those existed in this country. We've been able to stop that, at least, through the funding mechanism, through the appropriation process. And now we're fighting to ensure that they're not exported for slaughter. Why are we focused on this issue? Lots of animals are slaughtered. Why should we care about this? Horses are an interesting species. They enjoy a particularly popular sentiment in this country. We have a special relationship with them. Historically, they have helped us settle this country. They've won wars for us. They've been our companions. They've been our sport figures. They are much more like dogs and cats in our lives than they are like livestock. Does that demean livestock to say that? I don't think so. I think we're acknowledging where we are in this moment in time. We're also having to acknowledge that when you take an animal and allow them to become part of a food system that wasn't raised for that purpose, you're creating a lot of other side risks that need to be talked about. These horses, for those of you who have horses, you know, they are given fly spray and bute if they feel stiff, and they're given dewormers every few months. All of those things are labeled by FDA as incompatible with human consumption, in fact toxic. So we are allowing a mismatch to occur here. And by their very biology, horses are especially fractious. So the cruelty level of horse slaughter is extraordinary. The food safety risk is extraordinary. We are actually interfering with horse rescues by allowing horse slaughter to exist legally in this country, because these operators show up at our auctions and actually bid up on horses against horse rescues. So they're squandering the precious resources of a network of nonprofits that exist specifically to help horses in need. And they're creating artificial crises for them. So in every single way, we don't need this, we shouldn't have it. It doesn't matter if you don't care about horses, you should care about people consuming it. So we have a lot of good arguments here. And the good news on this, as Tracie pointed out, is we have this long-standing history of bipartisan support in Congress. So where are we on this issue with the administration? Should be an easy one, right? The Obama administration was always super supportive. They always had in their budget proposal that they wanted to ban horse slaughter in this country. Did the Trump administration adopt that? No, they did not. They actually came out with their budget proposal saying that they thought that we should reopen horse slaughter plants in this country. So there's a challenge in a big way, right? Where are we with Congress? We do have a lot of support. Every time this issue goes to the floor, we win it in a massive, lopsided, bipartisan manner. But in committee, we lost a few Republicans who retired last year that were hardcore supporters. And so when it came down to the vote, it wobbled, and then we lost by 2 in the heat of the moment. And that was in the House side. The Senate took it up, and it flew right through. Even Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell supported us. So that's interesting, right? That means we've got an interesting dynamic. Doesn't mean that we're done, because the Senate said what they said. They still have to harmonize these things. And that's done in a very untransparent, very oblique manner, and it's very difficult to influence that process. So our job is to keep the pressure up to leadership in the House and the Senate and encourage them to ensure we don't allow horse slaughter to start back up in this country. And obviously we also want to support a long-term ban so that we stop the export of horses for slaughter. The good news on that is, because the EU has been active in acknowledging problems with this industry, they've actually clamped down on American horses coming through Mexico and Canada, and we've seen a 38% decrease of horses exported this year, which is a significant change. So we have a lot of points of hope, we have a lot of challenges, and the pressure's critical. ASPCA.org/brigade. Join us. We also have a dedicated horse action team you can join if you have a special interest in being highly involved in this issue. It's one of those issues that requires more of our energy, so we have a dedicated team to work on that. So I think that's where we are on horse slaughter, and I remain hopeful on that because I think the politics favor us. So lately we've been struggling as a country in acknowledging some of the results of our inability to face and confront climate change, and it has resulted in the slowing of the jet stream and hurricanes that stop and drop huge buckets of water that never would have been possible in the past. We also are seeing wildfires out of control, and we are seeing ample examples of ways that industry and individuals are disrupted and their pets and the animals that they keep are harmed. by these disasters. What can we do about it? Well, we already have a statute in place at post-Katrina that ensured that pets should be considered in evacuation plans. But what we don't have yet in place is a provision that requires that those who hold licenses under the Animal Welfare Act, and there are a lot of them, these are people who display animals by the thousands, people who breed and conduct research on animals, people who mill puppies for the pet trade. There are a lot of people who get licenses under the Animal Welfare Act, and they don't have an explicit requirement to have a disaster plan in place. So under the Obama administration, we worked to ensure that we had a disaster plan requirement in regulation. And in 2012, USDA actually finalized that proposal, and it was to go into effect in July of 2013. And then all of a sudden, in that same month of July of 2013, USDA issued an indefinite stay without any notice and comment, by the way, lawyers in the room, saying that they thought they needed to further consider the impact of contingency plan requirements on regulated entities, taking into account a reexamination of any unique circumstances and costs that may vary by the type and size of business. Sounds so reasonable. They're just going to think some more. The problem is they already thought a lot. They had a full public comment period. That's been talked about. There was a full economic analysis that considered those impacts. What's really going on here? The question we always have to ask in this moment. So in that same month, on July 13th, the Washington Post issued this ridiculous article talking about a magician who was very concerned about this crazy disaster plan regulation and the overburdensome regulation of government, because what would he do with his rabbit? How this would force him to have a disaster plan for his rabbit. And believe it or not, and here's where I want to put some context on this administration, the Obama administration withdrew that rule days later out of embarrassment. And so that's scandalous, and that needs to be rectified, right? Well, we put pressure on them to try to address that and get that rule back out there, and said, surely we can plan for a rabbit. And they said, well, no, we really do need to consider those that have small numbers of animals. So we need to issue a regulation that explicitly provides for an exemption for those who have a de minimis number of animals. So they issued the de minimis rule in 2016. My way of thinking is, well, if you have a small number of animals, it's easier to plan, right? Seems kind of silly, but okay, they've issued that rule. They've done it. They did it in 2016. It's time for the final regulation. So we are, again, working to get that done. I'm hoping that the extraordinary hurricane season we've had will bring light to this need. Congresswoman Titus has issued the Animal Disaster Plan Act of 2017. She's introduced that just in the last few weeks. And I think that will put additional pressure on this administration to move forward with that regulation. Sometimes we have to introduce legislation to encourage regulatory action, right? So that's happening on that issue. And I will put that down in the we don't know yet category, but again, hopeful, because I think the evidence is mounting that it's needed. So what about the organic issue? We heard a little bit about this if you were there for the session yesterday morning when Suzanne McMillan, my amazing colleague at the ASPCA, was able to give us real detail and depth on what's going on around the organic label discussion. But just to give it some framing for those of you who weren't there, if you buy something that's organic, especially if it's an animal product, maybe you would think that it includes animal welfare in that label, and that would be a reasonable thing for someone to conclude. You're probably a pretty savvy, skeptical sort of group, and you may understand that labels aren't what they sound like, and yes, you're right about that. But when polled, the public has shown quite clearly that they believe that that would include welfare provisions. So that's a really interesting consumer issue suddenly, right? If the public has that perception, they're buying organic assuming animal welfare is incorporated into it. Shouldn't it be? Well, Suzanne makes a good argument that yes, it's in there. Clearly it's in the intent of the creation of the organic label. Was it implemented? No. There's been a long process for 20, 30 years trying to ensure that that label actually does include the provisions for animal welfare as it should. But what's happening now? So right now, people who farm animals in this manner can be called organic farmers. They can meet the requirements of that label, and it depends, as you heard Suzanne describe, on the certifying agent and what their interpretation is. So we obviously feel like there needs to be some clarification there. And there has been a lot of effort now to ensure that animal welfare is a consideration in the organic label. And we've worked closely, both of our organizations, Humane Society US and ASPCA, and a lot of other organizations have worked in a coalition to ensure that the label includes some meaningful welfare provisions for animals that are stuck with a life like this. That regulation actually got to final proposal level. It got to the very end of the process, and it was one of those that fell prey to this review that Tracie described for us. And as soon as, I'm afraid one of the problems we had with the last administration was some procrastination, which isn't unusual, but it led to opportunities for the current administration to take advantage. And so they have. And they have, on this case, they have delayed and delayed again the implementation of this regulation, and actually issued, as Suzanne told us, a new rule that offers 4 options. Should we implement this long-standing conversation we've had that considered every single option and concluded already on this? Should we go ahead with it? Should we delay some implementation further? Should we suspend it indefinitely, or should we actually withdraw it formally? So they're asking the public about that right now. That is coming. We have a deadline for implementation of November 14th. So we would encourage you to get involved in this issue now, aspca.org/brigade, and you can join us in that effort to ensure this administration goes forward on this. It's very important. What about other farmed animals and what's coming up on farmed animals? Every 5 years or so, Congress thinks about how they're going to provide massive funding for the farming of billions and billions of animals stuck on large industrial facilities, also known as the Farm Bill. And that's a pretty cynical way to describe it, and probably pretty accurate. But the reality is it doesn't need to be that way. This is a vehicle that comes before Congress, which, by the way, is kind of a rare thing these days in a dysfunctional organization like that. And it provides us with a moment, an opportunity to try to address the fact that the Farm Bill could incorporate so many good things for animals and could incorporate animal welfare. Right now it's comprised of all kinds of titles and then programs and funding authorizations under those programs. There is no animal welfare title. Those of you who live here in Portland are lucky enough to be represented by Congressman Blumenauer, who is a fantastic leader on this issue, who always provides his own alternative Farm Bill. And he is currently working with many of us on ensuring that we have animal welfare inserted into this package in a variety of ways. And some of the ways we can do that, because the way the Farm Bill works is it's always about value-added provisions to the market. So we're adding value by incorporating animal welfare, because we have lots of evidence that when animal welfare is included in farming techniques, then the public is more enthusiastic about that. There's a robust interest in animal welfare by consumers. So this is a value-added provision. So that is the argument we are working on, and there are a lot of conversations going on right now. I have my own doubts as to whether or not in an election year we're actually going to see a Farm Bill, and kind of the perennial joke about the Farm Bill is it's supposed to happen and there's a deadline, don't get to it, put it off. So it's not guaranteed that in 2018 it's going to happen. My colleagues tell me, yeah, it's going to happen. They're still on track. They're going to do it. So keep an eye on this one. This is a coming soon to you area. Finally, I wanted to mention something that Tracie's already covered, only because I think it is so important and because there are few things that we could talk about as opportunities today. And so we're double covering an opportunity that I think is really worth it. One of the problems we've seen, there are many under the Animal Welfare Act, as I'm sure you know, but the standards are not particularly high for those who breed dogs for the pet trade, and the enforcement is particularly poor, and we've seen lots of evidence of that through OIG reports, et cetera. But one other problem is that it doesn't matter how badly you fail as a producer and as a license holder. The government was more than happy, USDA was handing out licenses like candy over and over again, even if you were absolutely miserable in your track record. Wouldn't you think, any of us in our life, if we fell down that badly, would we expect an automatic pass? No, we don't get that. We have to perform according to the law. And so it makes no sense that this has been the practice. And so it is quite encouraging and a little bit surprising to all of us that this administration has said, hey, we're going to look at this. We're interested in the fact that licensing should mean that you're in compliance. Now, where will it go? There's still a lot of process before us. We've got to weigh in. And this is where public pressure, again, comes into play. And does matter. So we do have until October 23rd to get in comments. I'm also heartened by the number of comments that are already in. And if everyone here was to comment, that would add significantly to that number. And I really encourage you to do that. You can do that through either Humane Society of US or ASPCA's website. Again, we offer a way to do this in a way that doesn't require you having to go do all the groundwork. We provide you with the relatively simple talking points you need to turn to the agency, and then a one-click option for submitting them. Public comments are like that. It's actually okay that it's not a personal approach. You don't have to call the agency and tell them what you think. It's different than Congress that way. So it's actually pretty easy, and I hope every one of you will join us in commenting on the puppy mill issue. So as we get to the end of our talk, it's important to remember that not everything rests on Congress and not everything rests on the administration. We have a court system. I don't know any audience I'll talk to this year that will understand that better than you all. But if you're in that moment where you're trying to think about where to invest your energy, coming to you from someone who does policy work and has done that for a long time, I wouldn't dissuade you from wanting to be involved in policy, because I do believe that the pendulum does swing, and I think our moment will come back for having serious ability to move the needle in a policy way. But there's a real need for scrappy, hard-hitting, brilliant attorneys who are willing to go into the litigation realm. And if you have that aptitude, and if it's something of interest to you, I think it's a really good area. I think we should be breeding attorneys who are good at litigation right now, because we're going to need them. And I think that that is the backstop. There's plenty of time, because these things take a long time to unwind and get to court. So you could be in law school right now and set your sights, and you could really make a big difference. So I encourage that. I think that there's a lot of work to be done in this arena. Our hope was to be joined by Liv with Congressman Blumenauer today, who is his wonderful district staffer. So I was going to put this slide up and then hand it over to Liv, and she was going to tell you about the Congressional Animal Protection Caucus. So I'm going to do that instead. One of the notes of hope for us is that because we as a movement have done a good job maintaining relationships with both sides of the aisle, and there are other examples of social movements who have struggled with this. So I think we're a little bit unique. We enjoy real relationships with members of Congress and other officials who are on both sides. And they are committed to advancing this issue as a serious area of dialogue. And so one of the things we are so happy about is that the Congressional Animal Protection Caucus has remained a vibrant community for us. They've grown. They've done more outreach this year than ever before. 2017 is a record-breaking year for this caucus. And these are all the issues that they've been taking up, and there are more coming. So they are holding these briefings and encouraging staff and members to come and hear about these issues as the first step in inspiring support for these issues in the form of legislation and regulation. So it's a very, very important note that we have a long-term vision, and having an institution like this that makes it cool, makes it a serious effort to be involved on animal protection, it's really a sign of hope. So I would ask that you stay with us, that you don't get disheartened. There are going to be days, there are lots of days that we feel that the world's falling apart and that there aren't opportunities. One final positive note, I'm going to pick my words carefully. This is a really unique administration. It's unconventional. They don't follow the rules. Everyone in Washington's heads are exploding because this isn't how you do it. And there's a lot to be said for the convention and tradition and the ways we've done things, right? It's good to have a predictable decision-making process. sometimes it's okay to have something be unpredictable and a little chaotic. For one thing, he's been so busy with so many other issues that he hasn't gotten around to some of the things that we care about. So that's the negative side of it. On the positive side, I've been told by some pretty high officials in the cabinet that he makes his decisions based on his family members and other inner circle people around him. That's really crazy, isn't it? That's not how you're supposed to do it. That's wrong. All right, it's not how it's been done. It's probably not as professional as other administrations in that regard. But what it means is somebody nearby, that head of our government, can make a difference in a moment. They can weigh in the right moment. There might be opportunities that will come up that we can't even predict that might seem very untraditional. And our job is to acknowledge that, be ready for it, and be nimble. And when that moment arises, jump fast, because it doesn't stay open long. Those windows open and then they close. It may not be the most lasting form of change that we're able to move that way, but I think sometimes those things can be positive. And so my framework is to be ready, to be nimble. I'm going to go buy some Nikes today with Jennifer, wherever she is. And we're going to keep running as hard as we can. So join us in that, join the brigade, join our groups, because we want to use your time well, and we want to see you come to Washington. If you're ever there, we will join you on the Hill with your visits, and we will help make your advocacy effective. So I appreciate so much the work that you all do and the opportunity to share with you this soul-searching topic. And that's all I have formally, and I'm sure we're open to taking questions.
So we have some questions that have come in from our live streaming audience, but if folks want to line up, we'll take questions from you in the audience as well. Just first up, so if the majority of the budget for wild horses is going to wrangling and adoption programs like you mentioned, Nancy, what steps can we take to increase funding for contraceptive plans? It sounds like it is not so much the idea of not wanting to regulate or not caring, but simply not having enough money to do so.
Money. Is this on? Yeah, money's going to be a big issue, and that's such a perceptive question. I have to say, whoever, some smart person out there knows what they're talking about to ask that. So yeah, part of what's been a difficulty for Congress to provide funding to BLM is this history of mismanagement and kind of the history of failure. No one wants to give more money to that. And even our friends, we go to them and say, well, they need more money for this or that. It's pretty hard to do that when you know it might be squandered, and the history's shown that. So we're in this weird moment where I think the pressure is going to have to result in as I said, an ironclad agreement that the proper on-the-range management tools are going to be utilized. And if we can obtain that, that may free up the conversation around money. I realize this administration is talking about saving money, but the reality is there's always more funds out there, and the appropriations process proves that every single year. So even in the tight years, there's a way to find some funds, especially if there's confidence. And I think having the opposing parties on this issue come to some détente and some agreement around it would actually free up some of those funds. That's just my hope. I don't have evidence for that yet, but that's what I think would happen if we were able to find a viable solution that we could all get behind.
I hope that answers your question out there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your wonderful information. We heard from Allie Phillips of Sheltering Animals and Families Together yesterday, and I was just wondering if you could speak, either of you could speak briefly to the Pets and Women's Safety Act, and I also noticed on the 2018 Animal Welfare Congressional Caucus that they were going to be talking about domestic violence and animal abuse. And then I also was wondering if you could speak to, in your experience, whether you find animal welfare bills that are attached to human welfare bills have more success than just pure animal welfare bills, especially now when we're dealing also with sort of a blatant disregard for human well-being in the current administration.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Good question.
I'll address this.
this is one of the bills where I mentioned there were 240 or more co-sponsors. This bill has tremendous bipartisan support, and it's our hope that it will make it through, and this will be one of the ones that pass. And so we're working very hard, and the briefing that you mentioned, this is the one that's coming up, I think it may be even next week. And so it's an opportunity to get the experts up there and get more information out and let them visit their members. So I'm really hopeful that this one will get done.
Let me comment on the question, the secondary question about, do animal bills do better if they link to a human welfare advantage? Absolutely. And when you think about it, environmental bills do better and have a greater chance of passage if they provide a benefit to people. Any type of legislation that you can imagine tackling any issue does better if you can link it to a benefit to people. And I know that that can seem unfair. And, should we support something if we can't have it be advanced based on the pure justification for animals, which is more than enough? Yes, we should. We need to be pragmatic and realize that the entire world operates that way. And it is not offensive at all that there are sometimes members of Congress who couldn't care less about slaughtering a horse, but are worried about food safety. So I think that that's the reality of the world we live in. And I think also what happens is the minute someone gets on board for the other reason, the human reason, they start to become really convinced about the animal reason too. And I've watched members get on board initially for this reason over here and then migrate and become an incredibly strong spokesperson for the exact reason we want them to be on that bill. So I bet Tracie knows that too. I bet you've seen that a lot. So I think that is part of why those bills do better. Human nature.
We have another question from our live streaming audience. So Nancy or Tracie, can you address human population as the key to all animal welfare issues?
Boy.
You want me to?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yes, human population is a real issue, and we are a species ourselves. I think we all view it that way, and we've done an incredible job of impacting this planet. However, I think, in my own personal thinking, I think that more so than human population, it's the impact of climate change that needs to be capturing our attention in an urgent way right now. And I think that what we saw this year was just a precursor of what's coming, and we will soon need to realize the intersectionality of all of these issues around climate change instead of thinking that we're going to advance each cause individually. Because once crisis takes over, and there are predictions that are pretty dire, and it appears to be manifesting sooner than was thought. And once that happens, it throws us into a level of chaos that there's no time to consider women's rights, and there's no time to consider race or immigration or animals. There's only time to survive. And that will annihilate our ability to operate as independent organizations and independent causes. So I think if you're going to ask, what is the meta question before us? And I'm not representing the ASPCA in saying that. I'm sure that my colleagues would agree with that sentiment, but the reality is the science is coming out fast and furious, that climate change is the issue. And I would point you to some really amazing pieces just in the last month indicating that animal agriculture is the key. And it is more important than driving an electric car. It is more important than turning the lights off. It's more important than getting coal under control. It's more important than anything else we can turn to, because the methane control is a much more powerful way to bring down the climate threat than the CO2. So that's my little pitch for climate change, and I don't ignore human population as adding to that, but you know what? It's too slow to work on human population. Climate change is coming too fast. So that's my thought.
Hi there. An excellent talk. You could probably tell from my accent that I'm not
Georgia,
from here.
maybe?
Yeah,
Or
Georgia.
Florida?
Georgia. Yeah, that was a good guess. No, New Zealand actually. And so I come from a place of relative ignorance. And I'm a little bit overwhelmed, actually, by the sheer inertia and dysfunction of the entire system, if I can be so blunt. But at least that's explainable, and I can understand why there is inertia and dysfunction at a federal level. But when it came to your discussion of mentioning issues of rollback of wildlife reform, for example, the restrictions on lead hooks, for example, being rolled back, the delisting of grizzly bears, for example, as you discussed, Tracie, I don't really understand the motivation there. I don't really see why. I would have thought that would have been an easy win and a very easy thing for bipartisan support to be present for, and yet I'm just not really seeing why there have been so many attacks in that regard. I just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, it is perplexing, especially the lead one, that it could be rescinded, especially on the first day. But the fact is, there are some very powerful, wealthy people that are pushing hunting. And so that's why we're seeing the delisting of grizzly bears, the attacks on wolves, and then lead. The alternatives are a little bit more expensive, and there are certain people that don't. They want to continue using lead.
One thing I would note to that is that we just saw another mass shooting in Las Vegas. We've seen small children gunned down. We've seen examples of things that you would have thought would have inspired pretty swift action to try to address one way or another, whatever the answers might be there. But the gun control lobby is so well organized and so intensely focused on their own benefits. And they are an example to us that we must emulate as a movement in terms of being disciplined, being focused. You know, we can absolutely love or despise what they stand for, but we need to look at how effective they've been at working their issues. And I think that our system, to answer your despair, our system is very open to influence that way. And so should we step aside out of principle and not be a part of that and not want to play the game? Or should we be there for animals and be the voice for animals? So I think that's a pretty clear choice. But I do think that Tracie's right, that those who are pushing for hunting expansion have an incredible machine behind them, and we need to be a better machine.
Thanks, Tracie and Nancy, for giving us a way forward. My question actually is kind of coming full circle back to the wild horse issue. Probably a week ago on Science Friday, I heard somebody say that the PZP efforts with the wild horses are pretty much being funded right now by private agencies. And I just wanted to kind of check on that fact and see if there are efforts that are underway, presumably by nonprofits, to go ahead and to sterilize the horses, and if that seems to be one more tool to kind of try to help save them.
Well, I know there's a lot of the study to have a longer lasting PZP is going on with a lot of private funding. So I think that may be what you're thinking of, yeah, because we would love to have a longer lasting one.
And the development of the technology was heavily provided by the Humane Society of the United States in helping make sure the technology advanced. The ASPCA provided significant funding for PZP development. So the actual vaccine and ensuring that it was developed and brought to market has been heavily supported by animal groups. The reality legally is we can't go out and implement the vaccine without coordination with the agency. And that is actually happening. HSUS gets out in the field and does darting and does some really amazing work on proving that this works if you know how to apply it. So, thanks, Barb.
Thank you. So I'm hoping other people can benefit from this answer. I'm not sure. So I'm blessed to live in a very liberal part of Seattle. My congressmen, my legislators, everybody from the city level up, I usually agree with. They usually are promoting things that I agree with. So what can I do as a constituent, I mean, of them, they don't really need me pushing them, but I don't have really a lot of political weight in other jurisdictions. What is the best way for me to make a bigger impact? If you have any ideas, I would love them.
Absolutely. Do you
You
want to?
go ahead.
Okay. We both have answers. Okay, so it's a great question, and people also come with the alternative question of, my member of Congress is so awful and hates animals so much that I can't do anything with them. But the reality is, and it's true that those who are in the center are going to ultimately make the decision, one way or the other, on how these votes go. But the reality is, those who are so good that doesn't seem like they can do better, usually there is more they can do. They can not only vote the right way and co-sponsor the bills, but they can work behind the scenes to talk member to member. And you know, we could have a whole nother hour about how Congress works and how they're influenced, but the reality is it's a lot like high school. There are cliques, and there are people who like each other, and there are people who sit next to each other, and people who go on codels together, and people whose wives or partners know each other. Their kids know each other. So you got to figure out all those networks, and your member knows someone who can influence a vote in that middle piece. So a lot of it is developing the relationship with them and encouraging them to take those next steps to reach out to leadership. The other piece I would mention to you is, I can see Kelly Murray in your mind's eye. She's out in Yakima, Washington. So one thing that you can do too, because you live in a state and your identity isn't just Seattle, it's the state too. You can work on broadening a coalition across the state and creating a network that then works together and shares information. And you know, Kelly can work with, from her vantage point in her more challenging community, and you guys can coordinate. And you know, I'll tell you, going way back to when I first worked on a ballot measure in Oregon long ago, the state was so unorganized and so unnetworked before we started ballot measure work here that, you know, people in Bend didn't know people in Yachats and didn't know people. So part of what a ballot measure does is it connects everybody, and you get this crazy, amazing network of people who then talk really quickly and share information and resources. And that kind of coordination starts to look like the well-oiled machine that we need. So you can be a leader and go far past your own local jurisdiction and district.
Thank you for your answer. I
Yeah,
appreciate it.
yeah. So there's Kelly. Raise your hand, Kelly. You guys talk.
And I just wanted to add one side, and that's the executive branch, to not forget about that end. With the Obama administration, they took 125 actions to help animals, which is huge. So a lot gets done on the regulatory end. You know, with Congress, we see that they don't get a lot finished, but the agency can. So when comments come up, that's where I encourage people to weigh in and to go out to your network and encourage them to also submit comments, because numbers do matter. With the organic rule, 99.5% of the comments were in support of continuing the rule as written, and that's hugely powerful.
Hi.
Hey.
Thank you very much. I just had a question in regards to the PAC Act, in particular regarding sexual assault and whether or not you think it'll actually be passed in its current form, and if you think there could be a strengthening to that actual language involving sexual assault to make it more clear and explicit that animal sexual assault should be prosecuted.
So amazingly, and a lot of people don't realize this, bestiality is going on so much more than you would ever realize. And there's 5 states where it's legal. And so we found a website that had 1 million people that are part of this that talk about bestiality. And where the PACT Act comes in is they trade the animals across state lines. So it is significant, and we're getting out the information to people, and I hope you can do that too, to get people to weigh in with their congressional members.
How is that? What's the level of co-sponsorship?
PACT Act, that's one that's over 240.
Yeah.
It's
243 I last saw when I looked at it.
And you
Very
told
good.
me yesterday that you want to specialize in that area, don't you?
Yes, that's correct.
That's wonderful.
Maybe talk
Thank
to
you.
them.
I didn't even see you come up.
I snuck up.
Hi, and thanks to both of you for your contributions today. I had another question about the PACT Act, specifically pertaining to the typical state-by-state exemptions of farmed animals.
Yes.
from the PACT Act by removing or excluding standard industry practice, which we know in a lot of cases are inherently cruel. And I have an interest in this additionally because of the crowding and CAFO issues with overcrowding, as well as their environmental impacts, which Nancy, I thank you for touching on in some of the replies to some other audience questions. But yeah, I was just curious if those exemptions are still in the federal version of the...
They are, and the ag industry has not come out against this bill, and that's the main reason why. And you may not know, but right at the end of the 114th Congress, it passed through unanimous consent. So everyone agreed on the Senate side, and the bill got through, but it was right at the end, so it didn't give the House a chance. But there's really not much opposition to this bill at all.
And do you think, and that's largely because if those exemptions were in there, or weren't in there, then the ag lobbies would come out in droves against it?
Absolutely. And
Okay.
you know, we work on farm animal issues from many other ways, so it's not that we're ignoring it.
Of course.
We're working on it on the state level and many other, a downer calf issue was one that was big and was able to get done in the last administration.
Thank you.
Thank you.
More work to be done.